Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. It's a gorgeous day here in Southern California. I'm here back home in San Diego. It's Easter weekend and we finally have some decent clear weather. The storms have all cleared out and it's time for me to make some test passes with my no prep RC car that got put on the shelf because I went back to doing RC indoor off-road racing. This was something that I had built during COVID, and of course as things started to open back up, everybody went back to doing the indoor stuff and doing indoor off-road racing, and this vehicle got shelved. Now this started out as being originally the Associated short course buggy, and I converted it over because at the time, a couple of years ago when I first started this project, everything was kind of coming from the short course platforms from the Traxxas brand. That's what everybody was initially converting over to make themselves a short course drag vehicle. Well, I decided to do it from the Associated short course buggy that I had, which of course was at the time sitting on the shelf. Thought this was a pretty cool thing to go do and figured I'd make the platform. Well, I had to get some more parts for it, or so I thought, until just recently when I started cleaning things up on the workbench, which ended up finding a bunch of stuff that I already had that I didn't need to go out and buy, and was able to get the thing together and get things completed. So I got the body painted up here. It's actually through basically the same paint scheme I have with my off-road cars. You can kind of see it here. It actually came out looking pretty cool, and in the sunlight it looks even better. I've got a little bit of shade right now, so you'll see here in a minute just exactly how cool it looks in the sun. It actually came out looking really good. Now, I had to make some changes to it initially from when I did first get this project going. One of the biggest ones was the wheels. The wheel set that I initially bought was for the Traxxas slash conversion, thinking that I would have enough room for the wheel nuts to be able to fit on this car. Well, these axles are an 832 axle. It's an older setup, whereas Traxxas uses the M4 platform, the M4 wheel nuts, to be able to put the wheels on the car, essentially. And what happens is that because the wheels that I initially had have a little bit of a weird lip around where the lugs go, or where the wheel nuts go, the nuts didn't actually fit on there properly, and I couldn't get a wrench around them to really tighten things up, so I had to go out and buy another set of wheels. Otherwise, everything went together pretty decently. I do have some links in the description of this video that are at the bottom from when I first started this, so you guys can actually see some of the parts that I went through and used to get this car built up and get things going. So we're going to make a couple of test hits here. We're going to run it about 132 feet. I've paced off about that distance, which is what these cars run. Now, 132 feet is 1/10 of 1,320 feet, which is a quarter mile. And this essentially emulates quarter-mile drag racing, and no prep racing means that you're showing up and racing on a surface that doesn't have any kind of traction or adhesive laid down on it. You're basically just running with what's there on the surface and trying to make things stick. Now, this is a 13.5 setup, so there's not too much power here. I've got it under geared a little bit just for test purposes and for not letting it get too hot, because I can make a bunch of passes back and forth. So it's definitely going to need to have some gearing adjustments done to it, probably some suspension adjustments as well. I know the car will go straight because I did test it for about 30 or 40 feet just to make sure that everything was straight with that. So let me get the camera set up, let's take a look at what this thing does and see what 132 feet will do with this car. All you can do is really laugh. I hope you guys like the 4 little test hits there. Last hit ended up hitting the camera that was sort of at about what 132 feet was supposed to be. Didn't want to hit the camera, but thankfully GoPros are pretty durable, and no harm, no foul there, no harm to the car. So it's going to look pretty cool in the video, I'm sure. As I go back and edit it, I'll see it, and I'll probably laugh a little bit at it, my stupidity. So let's go back to the workbench. Let's take a look at some of the things I've had to do to this car to kind of get it where it is now, and some of the things I'm going to do to it eventually. Now, keep in mind, I don't have the module on it to kind of tell me how fast the car is. I mean, I could have counted the seconds there, but I was really more or less paying attention to just keeping the car straight, making sure it didn't hit one of the cameras on those test runs for you guys. So let's go look at some of the details and wrap some things up and get things going here. So I'll see you guys back on the workbench. All right, guys, we're back here at the workbench. I figured to give you a little bit more of a close-up look at the car and kind of where it's at. Hopefully the audio is a little bit better. I know outside I don't always get the best audio. Unfortunately, it's just me filming in a lot of these, so I don't really have a bunch of people to help me out with camera work, so what you see is kind of what you get. So I've got the other camera here so you get a little bit of a closer up angle on the car chassis as well. I actually found after that little bump and run that I had with the one GoPro that I actually lost one of the rear bearings that makes up part of the wheelie bar with this kit, but I was able to find it, so just a small hit, nothing too bad. Otherwise, the car held up without any kind of problem from that, so no big deal. So let's get the body off this thing, and we'll take a look here. And as you can see, I mean, it's pretty much just old school RC, so to speak. I mean, it's exactly what the short course buggy was, which a lot of that was based off of the original short course truck that came from Associated, and a little bit of the B4 and some of the T4. Now, most of this conversion came from a lot of parts from the B4 buggy that I was able to find through a local hobby shop here. If some of you are trying to do this, you may be able to get a little lucky on eBay. I know there's some guys out there like Shapeways that make some parts. Shapeways actually made the rear wheelie bar mount on this car, so that essentially really helped me out with getting that mounted. So as I mentioned earlier in the video, the thing that I really had to change was the wheel setup, because these wheels and these axles are an 8/32 axle. They're not like the M4 or 4mm setup like what's on the Traxxas cars, and that's what I initially had on here for wheels. So I had to change that around. That's really the only thing that I updated to really get this all going. I've got the ESC mounted a little bit off to the side, the other camera angle, which I'll bring this camera in a little closer so you guys can see it and get a little bit better view of it here. I found a spare plate that I was able to mount this ESC and get it kind of set up and wired. I sort of threw a lot of this together to kind of get it going and get it figured out. I need to clean up a little bit of the wiring. I know that there's a plate that you can buy to center set the ESC a little bit better to the chassis, which is something I'm going to have to look into, or maybe find a guy to 3D print one for me and just move the thing over and get the weight a little bit more balanced, because the car does want to kind of hook a little bit to one side. Now, part of that could be because the center diff on this car is kind of an open diff. I have not done anything to the differential on this, and I need to. I know that's one of the things I need to change, but I wanted to get the car up and running and just kind of see where I was at with the car from that aspect and just get it going straight. And I actually drove relatively straight without needing a lot of steering input, thankfully. So eventually the center diff is going to have some adjustments done to it. I'm either going to find a way to lock it so that I get a more even distribution of the power to both rear wheels. And I know 1UP Racing makes a center diff lock unit. It's an aluminum unit that goes in between the diff gears, and then you reinsert your axles. And it makes it so that you can just have everything set up and not really have to worry about running heavier diff fluid, which I may just switch to because I have some from my four-wheel off-road car that I could potentially use. Or just putting in like a piece of, like, I don't know, maybe clay or something to keep the rear diff gears from really rotating and allowing the car to turn. Now, the downside of that is that I won't be able to turn the car very easily, and bringing it back to me after making a run across the parking lot like what you were seeing is a little hard, because what you guys didn't see is that I could take the car down 132-ish feet like I was doing, get past where kind of the tail camera was, and flip the car around and bring it back to me. I didn't have to walk down, pick it up, bring it back, make another pass with it. So sort of one of the advantages to having a little bit more in the diff and making it so that you can actually run the car a little bit without having to go down and get it. Now, I know that this is drag racing, so essentially you don't need the car to turn. So there is a performance advantage to it. I'm going to have to test it out and see what it does and see if that'll help it a little bit. Now, something else that on this, if you can see in the chassis where the rear shocks are set, and I've really kind of got this set up just so that I can get the chassis balanced. I can make some adjustments here, and I probably will, is that the shocks are still, even though they're in the top position on the shock tower, they should really be more upright. I also know that 1UP Racing has, I believe, some upright mounts that help bring the shocks more vertical and really get the use out of the shock the way that it needs. Essentially, you don't need the shocks at an angle because you're running on a relatively smooth surface, even though it's on prep. You're no longer off-roading the car, which you're not supposed to be. And that's really a performance thing for off-roading, having the shocks at an angle. You really want the shocks as straight up and down as possible. So that's something that'll come later on as I start to do some more tuning with this. Another thing is on the front end. Now what you guys don't see, that when I put the body on this, it does look relatively level and it does sit between the wheels pretty decently. But when I first mounted the body to the chassis, unfortunately I had the car up in the air, and because of the way these front wheels sit, and if you look here on the other camera, as you pick the front end up, the wheels and the suspension all heads this way instead of straight up and down. Well, it's because this was once an off-road vehicle. So when it was sitting in the air, elevated, and I put the body on it, the front wheels were actually sitting a little bit more forward. So I actually had to readjust the mounts on the McAllister front mount here, and then re-drill the body holes in the back for where it was going to mount to the back of the chassis. And I was able to adjust the body a little bit, get things a little bit more evened up. So that at least was something that I was able to fix without too much problem. All in all, it's basically all there is to it. Even though this is an ESC that's out of essentially what you could use in an off-road car from Phantom, the battery is one of the setups out of one of my off-road buggies that I just threw in the car so I could run it, and I try to get the weight as far forward as I could. It does have a little bit of front-end lift on it. The car doesn't really wheelie too much, even with the wheelie bar set where they are. Now, being a 13.5 setup, you're not necessarily supposed to run a wheelie bar on the chassis. Some of the rules out there will allow it. I just kind of have it there for aesthetic purposes, and it's pretty cool looking. But eventually, I'll probably have to take the thing off if I ever want to run the thing in certain competitions, because I know certain classes don't allow the wheelie bar on the 13.5 class cars. Now, of course, you're probably wondering, why don't you just jump up to the Unlimited? The reason why that I haven't gone to the Unlimited and to a bigger motor setup is because when this class first started, it was supposed to be sort of an entry-level fun class, convert your short course vehicle over to doing this and run out a straight line and have some fun. Now, over the last 2 years, because of what's happened with this type of racing, and of course, technology being what it is, everybody wants carbon, titanium, and all the good hop-ups, all the guys that are in the Unlimited classes are spending thousands of dollars on their setup. I try to keep this as cheap as possible so I'm not putting too much money into it. Now, that being said, because Associated, Losi, and Traxxas have all come out with their own platforms, you can now actually go out and just buy your own setup. You don't have to do a conversion like what you see here. This is essentially for any of you guys out there that may have one of these. If you've got the short course truck and it's been sitting on a shelf, and you want to get it off the shelf and do something a little different, here's a chance to do that. Now, this is just one conversion that you can do. One of the other conversions that you can do with these, which is pretty interesting and what's become more popular lately, is dirt oval racing. Now, I haven't looked into that too much beyond just this platform that I have. But if you guys have seen other videos, I also have the short core, or I also have the B5M two-wheel drive buggy that I drove for the longest time. And I now have the B64 buggy that can actually be converted as well. So that's something I may touch on later on in a different video. For now, we're just taking a look at this. So all in all, that's it. I know the car is under-geared quite a bit. If you saw in the video, it had pretty good acceleration, but at about maybe 90 feet, you couldn't really see it. It just sort of reached its peak. So I need to kind of change the gearing on this a little bit to get a little bit more out of it, give it a little bit more pull. So it's really pulling all the way down that 132-foot mark. Because essentially you want your car to be constantly accelerating. You don't want it to just kind of reach a peak and peter out, because if you do, you'll possibly have another competitor go blow on by you. And of course, there's suspension adjustments on this that I need to make. There's probably some camber adjustments that I can make to both the front and rear. I've got it pretty zeroed out. The rear end does have 1 degree of negative toe in it. And it's one of the downsides to this car. I couldn't get it completely zeroed out. The reason being is because back in the day, and for off-road racing, you want a little bit of toe in on the rear for stability coming out of corners and for turn in. Well, you don't need that when you're just going in a straight line. And in a lot of cases, that can potentially cause the car to maybe hook a little bit one way or another. So keep that in mind, that you may have to be careful when you're setting this up to try and get these back wheels as zeroed as possible. So 0 toe and 0 camber. You don't really need a lot of angle on the tops of the tires as well. Dead center is really where you want to be from a setup standpoint. Same with your front end. You really don't need any kind of camber or toe settings. You want to try and get that as 0 as possible. And you can do that on most off-road vehicles when you're making your conversion. So that part's easy, thankfully. There's some other adjustments in here that we can make with some different shims, the angle of the ball joints, and where we have basically the hub carriers in the front, where they are on the suspension arms. That adjustment, of course, can be something for fine-tuning and just helping with getting the car track straight when you're going down the line. Especially when you're further down and you're really at your top speed, you want to make sure that the car is tracking straight along. Luckily, this car has stayed relatively straight, and the only time I really had a problem is when it drifted a little bit, as you guys saw in the video, and tagged the camera. So what are you going to do? Otherwise, this has been a really fun build. I'm glad to be able to kind of get things going with it. It was shelved for quite some time. And as I said earlier in the video, in the description of this, there's going to be some other links from when I first started this project, so you guys can kind of see where things started, the parts that I used, and so on, and where we are now. So that's pretty much it for this. I hope you guys enjoyed watching it. Make sure you guys like, share, subscribe, do what you can to help me out. I'll keep going with these videos. For now, this is Bravo Lucky 7 Racing, and I'll see you guys at the racetrack.